The next morning began as most did, dim light filtering through frosted windows, the hiss of the coffee pot in the background, the hush before the first customers arrived. Brooke arrived early despite the storm the night before, still brushing snow from her coat when Greg Sharp called her into the back. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The footage played on the tablet he held like a sentencing document. Grainy but unmistakable, Brooke, in her pale apron, stepping out the back door with a sandwich and coffee in hand. The timestamp blinked and read, 2:37 a.m. "You fed him," he said flatly. She offered no defense. She didn't explain that the food was going to be discarded. She didn't describe the way the man had stood, not begging, not breaking, just waiting in the snow like someone who had forgotten how to ask for warmth. Greg tapped the screen again. "We've had this rule for years, Harper. No handouts. No exceptions." "I understand," she said quietly. "You violated policy. That's theft. What you did encourages others. Word gets out, we'll have a line of them outside the diner every night." He turned to the door, already finished with the conversation. "You're terminated. I'll need your apron. You can grab your things after the shift change." She stood there for a moment longer. It wasn't disbelief. It was the quiet ache of inevitability. Brooke had known, in the moment she stepped into the snow with the sandwich, that there would be consequences. But she hadn't expected them to arrive so quickly or so coldly. The sound of the door swinging open drew the attention of the early staff and a few regulars sipping burnt coffee at the counter. They watched as Greg stepped out first, then Brooke followed, removing her apron with steady hands. She folded it, set it neatly on the counter, and nodded once at Kathy, the morning waitress, who had looked up from the register with stunned eyes. The bell above the door jingled as she left. Outside, snow crunched under her boots. Her breath formed clouds in the sharp morning air. By noon, her name had been posted in a local Facebook group. A customer, perhaps trying to defend the diner's stance, uploaded a still image from the footage, Brooke at the back door, sandwich in one hand, the shadow of a man in the snow beyond her. The post read, "Employee caught feeding loiterer, Pineway Diner says no to handouts." What followed wasn't a conversation. It was a piling on. Rules exist for a reason. You can't just do what you want. Next time it's one guy. Then 10. Then they're camping out. Probably part of some scam. Looks staged. Only a few voices rose in support. Quiet ones. Overwhelmed. Brooke read the comments once. Then she closed her phone and placed it face down beside the sink. Caleb was doing homework on the floor, his sleeves pulled over his hands, a blanket wrapped around his back. Their mother sat at the kitchen table, staring into a cup of tea she hadn't touched. "It'll be okay," Brooke said, forcing a smile. "I'll find something else." But the words hung limp in the air. They all knew it wouldn't be that easy. Over the next week, she applied everywhere within walking distance, restaurants, grocery stores, gas stations. No callbacks. Not even acknowledgments. Word had traveled faster than she could. She knew how people talked in towns like Greystone. It didn't take malice, just momentum. The story they heard wasn't about compassion. It was about insubordination, about charity at someone else's expense. The electric bill was the first to go unpaid. Then the phone. Brooke adjusted quickly, lighting candles in the evening, wrapping Caleb in extra blankets, boiling water to pour into jars for warmth at night. She rationed what food they had left, cutting back her own meals to ensure there was enough for him. Still, she said nothing. Each night, she folded her coat carefully and placed it over the only chair in the room that didn't wobble. She set her notebook beside a glass of water and opened it, pen poised. But the pages remained blank. For the first time in weeks, the words didn't come. It wasn't shame. It was the quiet weight of having done what was right, and finding the world had no space for it. Their mother tried to keep spirits up. She cooked what she could. She smiled when Caleb told her about school. But Brooke saw the worry deepen in the lines around her eyes, and the way her fingers tapped against the table when she thought no one was watching. On the third night, as Brooke returned from a fruitless job search, she noticed the sidewalk in front of the diner had been shoveled. She stood across the street for a moment, watching through the glass. Greg was inside, laughing with a customer. The tables were full. The snowstorm hadn't slowed business. No one looked toward the back door. That night, Brooke didn't light a candle. She sat in darkness, the silence thick, the coin still hidden in her coat lining, unnoticed, forgotten. And yet, despite the cold, despite the hunger, she felt no regret. She had made a choice. And no matter what it cost her, she knew this much: kindness, when unseen, is still kindness. That evening, as Brooke folded her coat across the back of the chair, something shifted beneath the lining, a small weight she hadn't noticed before. She reached into the inner seam, fingers brushing against something cold and metallic. Her brows furrowed. The coat had no pockets there. She pulled at the stitch gently, revealing a small coin lodged between the inner lining and the shell. It was smooth and solid. Heavy for its size. She held it up to the weak light above the kitchen sink. An eagle etched in silver stretched its wings wide, flanked by lightning bolts and a shield. Around the border, raised lettering read, U.S. Air Force Special Operations Command. Brooke stared at it. Beneath the emblem were tiny numbers and initials, JT. She had no idea what it was. But something about it made her pause. Alongside the coin was a piece of folded paper, no larger than a playing card. She opened it carefully. The handwriting was uneven but deliberate. Some debts can never be repaid, but they are never forgotten. JT. That was all. She read it again, this time slower. A strange stillness came over her, like the hush in a hospital room after a life has just been saved. Her first instinct was disbelief. Had someone slipped this into her coat? When? How? It wasn't possible. She hadn't worn that coat since the night she was fired, since the night she gave the sandwich and coffee to the man in the snow. Her hands trembled slightly. She turned the coin over again and again. It didn't feel like a trinket. It felt like a marker, the kind that carried stories most never told. She sat down slowly and reached for her old laptop. The screen flickered to life, barely charged. She typed in the words from the coin. Air Force Special Operations Command. The search results filled the screen: elite missions, covert operations, high-level personnel. Units deployed in some of the most dangerous corners of the world: Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria. She wasn't reading news anymore. She was falling down a rabbit hole, past medals and honors, past insignias and mottos. The coin in her hand was not a souvenir. It was a token of service. Recognition. Brotherhood. It was not given lightly. The initials was JT. Her mind returned to the man's coat. The way he had stood so still. The quiet strength. The dignity. It hadn't been just any coat. It had been military. And not some thrift store remnant. It had the air of memory, of purpose. He hadn't asked for food. He hadn't even knocked. He had simply stood there, in the storm, in silence. Her stomach twisted. She had assumed he was just a man who had fallen on hard times. Someone forgotten by the system, left to wander in the snow. But what if he wasn't forgotten? What if he had simply chosen not to be seen? She whispered the initials aloud, JT. The paper in her hand trembled slightly. It was just 2 lines of ink. But it felt heavier than everything else in the room combined. She wrapped the coin in the note and placed them on her nightstand, beside the water glass and unopened journal. She didn't tell her mother. She didn't say anything to Caleb. Some things didn't need to be shared to be real. The next morning, she woke to a frost-glazed window and the usual creaks of the apartment settling. She sat for a moment, coin in hand, before placing it in the pocket of her coat. It felt right there, close to her heart, hidden but present. The day was long. Her feet ached from walking across town again, handing out resumes that no one would read. A few people recognized her from the photo online. One woman at the bakery whispered something to her friend, loud enough to hear. "That's the girl who gave food to a bum. Got herself fired." Brooke said nothing. She smiled politely, thanked the clerk for her time, and left. That night, she passed the diner again. The lights were on. Customers warmed behind fogged windows. Her stomach growled at the smell of grilled onions and baked pie that drifted into the street. She didn't linger. Back home, Caleb sat on the couch wrapped in a blanket, legs tucked underneath him, watching an old cartoon rerun with the volume turned low. Their mother rubbed her temples with one hand and held a lukewarm cup of tea in the other. Brooke set down a bag of reduced-price bread she'd found at the corner store. She began preparing toast, slicing it carefully and toasting it in the pan to conserve energy. Caleb smiled at her, not fully, just the way kids do when they're trying not to make things harder than they already are. After dinner, she sat again by the nightstand. She opened the journal, the pen hovering for a long moment before it touched the page. "I didn't give him anything more than a sandwich and a coffee. But he gave me something heavier, the knowledge that someone, somewhere, noticed. That kindness, no matter how quiet, is never lost." She underlined the last sentence twice. When she turned the coin over one more time, she noticed a worn groove along its edge. Someone had carried it often, maybe even every day. Not in a display case. Not for show. For meaning. It was not just a token of the past. It was a symbol of respect, given by someone who knew the cost of silence, of humility, of standing in the cold without asking for help. She placed it back on the nightstand, this time with reverence. Outside, the wind howled again. But inside the apartment, something had changed. A warmth, small but steady, had returned to the room, not from the heater, but from hope. At first, it was the sound that made people pause. A low hum, barely noticeable above the early morning wind. Then came the distinct chop of rotors, growing louder by the second, too rhythmic, too forceful to be mistaken for commercial traffic. Brooke heard it while tying her brother's shoes. The noise vibrated through the windows before she could register what it meant. Her mother stood at the stove, spatula in hand, staring blankly toward the sink. Then came the flash, a ripple of shadow as a dark helicopter passed over the roof, close enough to rattle the silverware. Caleb bolted to the window. "Mom, there's trucks. And soldiers." Brooke rose slowly, heart racing. She opened the front door and stepped outside. The streets of Greystone, usually slow to wake, were alive in a way no one could remember. Residents poured out of houses in slippers and coats, phones in hand, recording, questioning, following the echo of engines that moved with purpose. Down on Main Street, armored vehicles rolled past shuttered storefronts. A line of Humvees followed, uniformed soldiers inside, faces unreadable behind glass. Then came the helicopters, 3 of them, sweeping over the diner and circling back like hawks over a fixed point. And at the center of it all, Pineway Diner. It looked absurd, almost theatrical, to see such firepower parked outside a roadside cafe known for watery coffee and burned hash browns. Greg Sharp stood at the window, frozen behind the glass, lips moving in a half-formed protest. He looked like a man who had suddenly realized he wasn't the one in control anymore. Brooke didn't move. She watched from across the street, standing behind a crowd that had big asterisk N to form. Some people recognized her. Whispers passed through the gathering like static. The convoy halted. Soldiers disembarked in silence. Then a figure emerged, not in fatigues, but in dress uniform. Medals lined his chest. A commander's hat sat squarely on his head. He carried himself with the stillness of a man who had seen war and survived it not through brute force, but through deliberate restraint. The town didn't know who he was. But Brooke recognized something in the way he walked, the dignity, the precision. The same quiet gravity the man in the snow had carried. He was flanked by an honor guard. They approached the diner. Greg opened the door before they could knock, stammering words that didn't land anywhere. Is something. I don't. The general didn't answer immediately. He stepped inside, removing his gloves slowly, surveying the small room like it was the most important battlefield he'd ever entered. Customers stood up instinctively. A few saluted. Most just stared. The general looked Greg in the eyes. His voice was calm, but it carried the weight of command. I'm here because a soldier's dignity was preserved here last week. Not by this establishment, but by one of its former employees. Greg blinked, confused. What? The general turned to the crowd. General Jackson Turner. Retired. U.S. Air Force Special Operations. The name sent a current through the room. Phone stopped recording. No one spoke. He continued, I served for 32 years. In places most of you will never hear about. I've known men and women who gave everything for a country that often forgets to say thank you. I buried my wife 3 days ago. On my way home from the funeral, my vehicle broke down. No phones. No assistance. Just snow and silence. He looked out the window briefly, then back. I walked for miles. I stood outside this diner. I didn't ask for help. I didn't speak. But someone noticed. He reached into his coat and pulled out a small velvet box. He placed it gently on the counter beside Greg. That someone was Brooke Harper. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Brooke stood frozen. The general gestured toward the door. A soldier stepped forward with a large envelope and an official seal. Miss Harper, the general said, eyes scanning the crowd until he found her. You gave a stranger a meal. And dignity. Without recognition, without assumption. That act is not forgotten. He nodded to the soldier, who walked toward Brooke and handed her the envelope. Inside was a letter from the Department of Defense. A full scholarship, tuition, housing, and stipend to complete her nursing education. Brooke's knees nearly gave out. People began to applaud, slowly at first, then louder. Someone from the back shouted, "She's the one from the photo." But this time, the voice carried pride. Greg Sharp had turned pale. He tried to speak, but the words wouldn't come. The general turned toward him one last time. Sometimes, leadership isn't about rules. It's about knowing when to break them. The plaque was unveiled that afternoon, mounted near the front window of the diner. Simple and clear. In honor of those who choose compassion when it's not convenient. No fanfare. No ribbon. Just truth. The military convoy left as quietly as it had arrived. The town stood in silence long after, unsure of what to say. Brooke held the coin in her hand that night, tracing the letters again. It hadn't been an accident. The man in the storm hadn't just disappeared into the night. He had come back, not as a stranger, but as someone who carried the weight of history and the grace to remember kindness. And in doing so, he changed everything. The days that followed unfolded slowly, like the early thaw of winter, not loud, not sudden, but inevitable. The story spread first through Greystone, then through the neighboring counties. Local reporters called. State outlets followed. National news soon caught wind of it, the small-town waitress who had given a sandwich to a stranger, only to discover he was a war hero. But Brooke never returned the calls. She let the world speak without her. She had no interest in being a headline. Instead, she kept her promise to herself. The letter from the Department of Defense had been real. Within a week, she stood on the steps of the nursing school she had once left behind, a full scholarship in hand. Tuition paid. Housing arranged. Books, uniforms, supplies, all covered. A separate note, tucked discreetly into the envelope, had arrived and signed but typed on military letterhead. Some of us carry we*P*NS. Some of us carry kindness. Both are forms of courage. She taped it inside her journal. Caleb began to sleep through the night again. Their apartment grew warmer, both in temperature and in spirit. Her mother, cautious at first, wept openly when the acceptance package arrived, the kind of sobbing that comes not from grief, but from the sudden release of long-held fear. The community shifted, too. Quietly, awkwardly at first. People began to nod when they saw Brooke on the street. A woman at the pharmacy paid for Caleb's asthma medication without a word. Someone left groceries at their door with no note. Greg Sharp, after weeks of unspoken pressure, sold Pineway Diner. The buyer was a younger woman from out of town, a culinary school graduate looking for a fresh start. On her first day as owner, she posted a note near the register. Effective immediately, all unsold meals will be donated nightly to the Greystone Shelter. Warm food should never go to waste. Neither should compassion. The plaque remained in its place near the front window. And though many people passed by without seeing it, those who did often paused. Just for a moment. Just long enough to remember. Brooke moved through her first semester with quiet focus. She didn't attend interviews. She declined book offers. She turned away cameras. When asked why, she simply said, "The story isn't mine. It belongs to everyone who chooses kindness without being told to." Her classmates knew only a fraction of her past. To them, she was calm, deliberate, precise. She became known for her steady hands and the way she always sat with patience longer than necessary, listening without rushing. One evening, as she walked to class, she passed a bulletin board cluttered with flyers. One in particular caught her eye, a veterans volunteer drive at the local shelter. Without thinking, she took a slip of paper from the bottom and placed it in her pocket. She began volunteering that same week. Every month, she donated quietly to a military family's fund, the exact amount she had once earned during her longest week at the diner. She never missed a month. Sometimes, she returned to the sidewalk outside Pineway, now rebranded as Hearth and Oak. She never went inside. She just stood across the street, remembering the snow, the silence, the man who hadn't knocked. And sometimes, she spoke softly to herself. Kindness is a language spoken by the brave. On the one-year anniversary of that storm, a package arrived with no return address. Inside was a first edition of Man's Search for Meaning by Viktor Frankl. On the inside cover, in slanted handwriting. To remind you that between stimulus and response lies the freedom to choose. JT. She closed the book gently, hands resting on the cover. Later that week, she found herself walking past the Veterans Hospital. She stopped to read a nameplate at the entrance. General Jackson Turner. Bronze plaque. Clean lines. A folded flag behind glass just inside the foyer. She didn't go in. She didn't need to. A few days after, she visited the town square. A new memorial had been added beside the existing war monument, a simple bench. On it, carved into the wood. In honor of unseen kindness. That morning, Brooke saw a girl in a junior ROTC uniform stand before the bench. Young, no more than 16. She placed a single red flower and stood in silence, back straight, hands at her sides, for exactly 1 minute. Then she walked away. Brooke sat for a while after that, letting the quiet hold her. The sun warmed the stone beneath her palms. Later, in her journal, she wrote, "Kindness is not heroic. It's human. It is what we owe one another, not when it's easy, but when it matters most." Taped inside the cover was a small fortune cookie slip she'd saved. Your greatest contribution may be the one no one ever sees. When asked, later, if she would do it all again, the sandwich, the firing, the fallout, her answer never changed. Some choices are always right. No matter the cost.